This is the Human Action Podcast with your host, Jeff Deist.
Hey, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to another episode of the Human Action Podcast. Across from me is not Dr. Bob Murphy, it's Jordan Schachtel, who I'm sure many of you know from his Substack, which you should check out. It's at dossier.substack.com, I think. Is that correct, Jordan?
Correct.
And he has spoken at Mises Institute events. He's appeared on our site and has also appeared on the show in the past, but we thought we'd have him back on, and Bob's off this week. So, Jordan, let me just, conversationally speaking, talk a little bit about the Biden administration, what I consider a little bit of a gambit. And we've seen it in drips and drabs over the past couple months. I mean, first you had the DOJ and the FBI in this big raid on Mar-a-Lago, which, of course, a lot of people like us are viewing in political terms. Then maybe a week or so ago, you had Biden at a rally talking about MAGA deplorables as semi-fascist was the term he wanted to use. And then last night, as of this recording on Wednesday in the middle of the week, he was talking about assault weapons and how he wants to ban them and how these brave right-wingers, they need their own F-15s if they're going to fight against the government. It seems like there's a ramping up of this. It's really almost a Saul Alinsky tactic, number 13, where you try to isolate and personalize a particular segment. And so I guess what they're counting on is that maybe they can make so-called extreme deplorables, extreme MAGA types seem so beyond the pale that it drives people away from them and helps them in the midterms.
Yeah, I think they've already done this somewhat successfully with the prosecution of the January 6th protesters and trespassers. And they're kind of just, it seems like they're in this state of mind where they're just seeing what they can get away with. Like, let's call them fascists. And then someone from the administration goes on MSNBC and then refers to a general group of right-wingers as terrorists. And then Biden says, they have no chance with their guns. You might as well give them away. We'll carpet bomb you with an F-15 if you try to resist the federal government. So you're right. They do seem to be inching towards this troubling path, this divide and conquer momentum. But I think it's very difficult for the Biden administration, which operates within this uniparty, to point out exactly who they're targeting. Sometimes they go after just like the Second Amendment in general. Sometimes they say like the MAGA people, but it's very unclear. And it seems that anyone who opposes the uniparty system, that seems to be their focus right now. And they just want to get us all under this umbrella of, domestic terrorist, fascist, possible terrorist, sick the FBI on people, sick the IRS on them. It's definitely a troubling state of affairs heading into crucial elections in just a couple months from now. But I wonder if they have some kind of trick up their sleeve, because it seems that the federal government is becoming just untethered from the law as each day passes. And I'm thinking there's going to be some kind of October or September surprise that they're going to hit at us. And that these three-letter agencies are willing to play these games of entrapment and baseless accusations. So I think we have some rocky months ahead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure about the midterms. I think Republicans will do an excellent job of blowing this opportunity they've been given. And I also think that when it comes to 2024, there's no way that the powers that be will ever allow Donald Trump to become president. I mean, popular vote, electoral college, doesn't matter. Whether they have to try him for a crime and try to disqualify him under the 14th Amendment, whatever it might be. Donald Trump's never going to be installed as president again in this country. I would bet, almost any amount of money on that. But here's what's strange. Is this, this dehumanizing language like maggot and fascist and deplorable and traitor and all this kind of stuff. I mean, that's very different. It shows you that they're now falling back on this idea. Well, there used to be good Republicans like Mitt Romney, and George W. Bush, who's now sainted. on the left. And Dick Cheney. I mean, any of us who are over, let's say, 30 or 40 can remember back when, they were calling George W. Bush a fascist. They were calling Mitt Romney all kinds of horrible things for daring to run against Barack Obama. I mean, this is an absolute gaslighting campaign. There's no good old days in the GOP if you're a lefty.
Yeah, to me, it's just like, yeah, you guys can take these old Republican hands away from us if you'd really like to. I mean, the Bushes, the McCain legacy, the Romneys, the Cheneys, they've always been, I think, a part of this uniparty system. I think Republican voters, especially, are coming to realize that, hey, we kind of got fooled the last couple decades, so let's try not to go through this cycle again. And I think there was a lot of things in recent history, particularly the pandemic, that opened a lot of minds to the possibility that we're just being consistently played. And I think that's where an institution like Mises comes in, where you can kind of see through this two-party dynamic, and that there's more important things going on, and who's controlling the levers of society and all that stuff is so important. And I think that, from an optimistic perspective, there's more engaged Americans right now. So it should be interesting to see, again, how these months pan out.
Yeah, I guess that's true. If you look at the Republican candidates for the House and Senate, they're an uninspiring bunch. I mean, I don't understand why they're not able to talk about capitalism or opportunity or prosperity in more coherent or cogent ways. They just seem to fail so badly. Let me read you a tweet from our friend Tom Woods. This was pretty good. He says, the progressives are running on, you won't be able to afford a car. Cockroach milk is actually quite nutritious. Here's some sludge to eat. Your energy bill will skyrocket. We're propagandizing your kids about gender theory, cutting off their you-know-whats. You'd think they'd be vulnerable. I mean, if you can't beat these guys, that's what's so interesting about politics, is that the things that people truly believe are actually deeply unpopular. And yet we have this mythology about democracy in this country, just absolute nonsense.
Yeah, I forgot who it was saying, who said this. I saw it on social media last night, that the only thing that the people who are tied to the regime really care about is having the right to vote. Everything else, they'll just give away that right instantly. So it's just, it's like, it again goes back to this democracy project in the Middle East mentality, where the holy grail of morality is the right to vote, to cast your single ballot, and then everything else that happens, good luck. But yeah, the Republicans, I think that they're just acting as a force of trying to put the brakes on the Democrat agenda, but not really having an agenda of their own. There's been this weird thing with the rise of populism. There's been many good things involved, but I think that there's a concerted attack also on free markets, because they're associating the current system with a free market as if that is anything close to the reality right now. So I think we have a task on our hands to definitely educate the public, especially about what a free market actually looks like, because it certainly isn't what's happening on Wall Street. So I think that there's a lot of people with legitimate grievances about how families are really struggling right now, and they're looking to these leaders for solutions. But I think it's definitely our job to put some better solutions in front of them that might not necessarily be offered by politicians.
Yeah, and the social issues dominate, right? People think economics is boring because they don't view economics holistically the way we would. And here's what terrifies me. I mean, you have all kinds of developments of late. Obviously, Biden is going to try to talk about the soul of America and talk about our democracy and this and that. And all of this obscures the absolute economic catastrophe which is out there. We're talking about trans. We're talking about guns and these terrible school shootings. We're talking about abortion. These are things that get people out in the streets, literally in front of the Supreme Court. Nobody ever riots over capital gains tax cuts or whatever. And this is what Republicans do. When they get in office, they give us capital gains tax cuts. That makes Goldman Sachs and Silicon Valley wealthier to give money to Hillary. I mean, Republicans really are the stupid party. But if you look at some of the things happening, and I know you've been covering this in the energy markets, really we've shot ourselves in the foot with food. Some of the food shortages and crises that the rest of the world is going to face, but that's going to increase our prices here. Car payments, the average car payment now is over $700. You have to pay full sticker at the dealer because there's so few on the lot still, with supply chain issues. Rents, I actually read an article by my friend Mike Mahari on Peter Schiff's website today that says, real rents have gone up 15% in the last year. Okay, so these rent hike notices are basically evictions for a lot of people. 8.5 million people are behind on their rent. About 4 million of them are likely to be evicted in the next few months. So that's between now and the midterms. Gas prices have come down, Jordan, but that may be in large part because of draining the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. So you've just got these really fundamental economic issues that everybody faces every day. I mean, very visible. Gas prices, grocery prices. And it seems like Biden and the Democrats might get away with having the midterms not be about any of that.
Yeah, it's really eye-opening to see what's going on in Europe. Like if you talk peak energy crisis and you think about government taxation, it didn't really even occur to me how bad like these taxation systems are, especially like a VAT tax where you have a set percentage. If you're paying 5x in your energy bill, as opposed to your 2021 energy bill, the VAT tax is just going to hammer you even harder. So I have no idea how people are going to be able to afford things with the increase in prices and then the increase in taxation. And yeah, like Republicans might cut your taxes, but the skyrocketing energy costs are just a huge issue. And then the government is creating problems on top of that issue. I think that America, at least from an energy perspective, is a lot less vulnerable than these European powers that decided to basically declare war on their biggest energy buyer. Well, they are the biggest energy buyers for Russia. So it just seemed that there's incredible hubris in Europe that we're also seeing in the United States. But I think nothing as bad as the German example of them like trying to talk tough to Russia, where when Russia has the power to shut their lights off, it's a fascinating display of where we are, as a Western civilization today, or as people who claim to represent Western civilization. It just seems there's these utterly foolish policies, and as you know, there's been this debate on the right for a long time whether we are witnessing a controlled demolition, whether this is some type of like idiocracy in play. I'd like to get your thoughts on that, because it seems that through my circles, there's a lot of momentum for the controlled destruction, deliberate destruction, through this ESG portfolio, or through rolling back these energy contracts, these drilling contracts. I'm still kind of undecided, because like I spent 7-8 years in Washington, D.C. I know how the government bureaucracy operates, that they would have some kind of like genius plan to detonate us. So maybe it's some kind of hybrid, but I think that's something that is worth thinking about these days.
Yeah, I don't think the average bureaucrat has that in their wheelhouse. I think they're just true believers and they're going along with this. But I certainly think there are malevolent actors in the world who are pushing anti-fossil fuel agendas, for example. Having just finished Alex Epstein's book on the fossil future, I mean, people who talk about getting rid of fossil fuels and getting rid of nuclear, are just insane. The only way that is remotely possible in, let's say, the next 50 to 100 years would be a dramatic and radical diminution in our material lifestyles across the world. Not to mention in developing countries where they might actually like to have some air conditioning and some cars of their own. So it's absolutely insane. And so when the numbers don't add up, when they're that far off, at some point you have to question the people making those arguments. You have to say, are they insane? Or are they actively seeking to harm us? I guess in a sense it doesn't matter. But what's so fascinating to me about this is it wasn't that long ago, even Bill Clinton said it's the economy stupid, or maybe that was Carville said it's the economy stupid. And yet today it seems like I mean, any party that was pushing material deprivation, whether that's air conditioning or how much you drive your car, or whether you substitute, cheaper food at the grocery, inferior goods, as we call it in economics, whatever it might be, you'd say, well, that's crazy. That party's going to lose. But it doesn't feel like that in America at the moment. I mean, it feels like the party of privation might just win.
Yeah, it's tough to get a sense of where Americans are, where the average American is at on these issues, because of course we're very far removed from the principles of the American founding. We're revolting over like a 2% tax on something. So it's I guess we'll see, right? Like, I think that the United States is in this position of being a late republic, that there is going to be a new system that forms. I'm not entirely convinced of what exactly that system is going to look like and whether things are going to get a lot worse or better. I think, from my perspective in Florida, I'm hoping for the collapse of the federal bureaucracy somehow, that, they'll just keep their hands off of Florida and we'll figure things out from here. And we'll have this kind of decentralization, but it remains to be seen for sure exactly what the future is. But I think that the standing of this 50 United States, and that we're just going to elect Republicans or elect Democrats, and things are going to. I think that this regime, the system that we're in, is going to destroy itself one way or another, and we'll see. Who's left to pick up the rubble from that.
Well, sometimes late stage republics break up into constituent parts. And that's certainly what we would hope for here, and let those constituent parts battle it out for, the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, the breakup of the former Soviet Union, those weren't pleasant or fun things, but I would say in the long term, they yielded better outcomes. And so hopefully we can look at it that way. But there's also, I think, a lot of good energy created by the last few years, by the COVID regime, by this incredible political division we experience. I think it's created a lot of people who have changed their minds, people who have rethought things, people who have been forced maybe through their own family situations or loss of a job or having their kid thrown out of school or whatever it might be. It's definitely brought some people over to our side. And I don't mean that in a left-right continuum sense so much as a more open-minded side. And you do get a sense, you get this in left media as well, that people understand that the economy feels fake. It feels financialized, like it's running off fiscal and monetary stimulus, which I would argue it is, by the way, and that companies are engaged in more financialization, stock buybacks and rent seeking and that sort of thing, more so than they are actually producing goods and services in better and cheaper ways and finding new markets the way they should be. And that, most people are not invested in the same way that, let's say, even my parents' generation were. I mean, look, if you talk to old timers, especially in the Beltway, they will tell you that Watergate's when everything changed. That's when the entire premise of goodwill or bipartisanship, and which may have been complete BS, but nonetheless, it existed. I mean, in Bob Novak, the journalist book, he has this memoir. He's going up the elevator in the National Press Club building with a friend, and the elevator opens near the top floor, and then Senate Majority Leader LBJ gets in the elevator. And he's completely plastered, drunk off his ass. And they realize that he's going to have a hard time the rest of the night. So they grab him and they take him down the elevator and they get him in a cab and they send him home. And that's just how it was. There's no TMZ. It never dawned on them to write an article about this in the Washington Post or something. I mean, it was just such a different world. And it wasn't that long ago that people would they would have their fights over presidents. I mean, FDR was hated by a lot of people. JFK was hated by a lot of people. Certainly Nixon was. Clinton was hated by a lot of people. But there was still a sense that, people would have a picture of the president in a school, and there was still some sense like if the president came, you'd be respectful to them and you wouldn't view them as some kind of enemy. You would view them as someone who just viewed the world differently and had different politics. And with that gone, democracy doesn't become some sort of down the middle compromise where we all get a little bit of what we want, but the extreme left and extreme right are shut out. It doesn't become that at all. It becomes this sort of death match to control the apparatus with a slight majority in Washington, D.C. and the presidency, winner take all thing. And then your job is to set about how to vanquish the other side politically. And that's what Biden sounded like last night. He wasn't pretending to represent everyone in America or even to govern them. His talk was like, we have to vanquish these bad MAGA people.
Yeah, it seems that the message of vanquishing the other side has resonated with Republicans more recently, because Republicans used to be the nice guys that would get rolled over by the left that wants to vanquish them. But you're right, like it's not necessarily a good development that a lot of politicians on the right now, the lesson is that they need to be more like their political opposition as opposed to actually doing something to fix the tremendous problems of the country. But it does make me think, like, when you're talking about the financialization of the economy, and how long this has been occurring, I've been doing some reading for a potential project about the history of BlackRock, and it's formed by another giant asset manager, Blackstone. And they were engaged even in the 80s and 70s in these leveraged buyouts, which were considered, like, today they wouldn't be considered risky at all. But you were still kind of like creating value that wasn't really there. And I wonder if this, like, the economy that we're facing now is just like, of course, Nixon came off the gold standard in the early 70s. But I think it's just like this effect of the folks on Wall Street just trying to outcompete each other with these financialization tools and using more and more leverage. And then when the bill hits, like a perfect example, the 2008 disaster that occurred under the Obama administration. And the lesson, they didn't really seem to learn any lessons from that. And then again, there's this encouragement from the government. But on the political side of things, you're right that I don't really have an easy, because like I'm very politics is like a fun hobby. I don't think of it as like a solution to our problems, but I'm certainly engaged with a lot of people, a lot of influential people in politics, and I think you're absolutely right about this lesson that they seem to just want to be in charge and have these tools at their disposal, and then like declare war on their political enemies using these bureaucratic institutions that have already been established in Washington, D.C. against their enemies. But I think that's strategically, tactically unsound, not just because it's a bad idea and not productive, but I think that the administrative state has very much taken sides already. And like the idea, I tend to agree that it's going to be very difficult to see a President Trump term two. Like, look what the FBI tried to do to him for 4 years and continues to do to him. They hate this guy. They do some horrible things. The administrative state has a lot of power, completely unchecked power. And the idea that, like, I hope that the lesson instead is to try to disband these institutions, as opposed to try to like convince them, hey, you're our shock troops now, and we're going to go after the other guy. I just don't think it's feasible, even if you want to just try to destroy the other side.
Well, I think when most Americans complain about the government, what they really mean is the federal administrative agencies, right? I mean, or maybe they mean their mayor and their town's not fixing a pothole or something, but basically that's what they mean by the government. It's not Congress, it's not the Supreme Court, it's not even the president. I mean, if you read Bob Woodward's book Fear, and he's no Trumper, he has a couple chapters in there about just the open insubordination that Trump faced, a lot like JFK faced, by the way, from his own Joint Chiefs, from the CIA, from his own military, from his own family. I mean, it was really something. And so this is why, dopey libertarians say, well, we need to reduce government because you Democrats are so happy now that you control everything, but the Republicans might win the next election, and then they'll turn all that administrative power on you. Well, no, they won't, because administrative agencies will just say no to a Republican president, right? The IRS, it doesn't matter whom you appoint as head of the IRS. The underlings of the IRS are not going to go after left-wing groups for their 501c3 status, for example. It's just not going to happen. It's too late. Institutionally, they've been captured a long time ago. So you can say that about any agency, especially the spy agencies, CIA, NSA, FBI, especially the DOD and the Pentagon. I mean, they are now fully woke, and that's it. There's no going back.
Yeah.
So this idea that be careful what you wish for, administrative agencies, they are the government unto themselves. They do what they want. So why do we care so much about a president? I'm not sure we do. I mean, I'm not sure there will ever be another Republican president. Trump shattered a lot of people's brains because there was this, socialism is inevitable. That was what we were told. It was scientific and inevitable. That's what we learned in the early 20th century. And when that turned out to not be true, we came up with this sort of soft variant of democratic socialism in the West. And so the left in America was convinced that because of demographics, pretty soon Texas and Florida would be blue. And that would be it, right? That would be the end of the GOP in national elections. And so when Trump won, and of course Hillary was going to be the first female president. So when that didn't happen, I think they really, really psychologically took a hit. And now with COVID and a lot of people moving, Texas and Florida might be getting a tiny bit slightly redder for all we know. So, I mean, but I just have a hard time believing that they would allow like a Ron DeSantis, even with a clear popular and electoral vote. Well, I think they would just come up with something on him. They would tie him to Trump and call him a fascist and somehow make him, just a candidate that's beyond the pale. And if this happens, Jordan, if the Republicans ultimately lose out to demographics or otherwise, and the Democrats become the majority national party, they'll just be a left and right wing of the Democrats, right? I mean, do we really care that much? I mean, Mitt Romney will just be a right Democrat. Does that matter to us?
Yeah, it's controversial to say this, but I think that the CCP model is exactly the direction that we're heading in if we're not already there. This idea that because we get to cast a vote every 4 years for president, that we're somehow like this free society now. We're so far removed from a free society, and it seems that our politicians and our administrative state look to Beijing and they think, oh, that's pretty cool. You have like all this authority, these bureaucrats managing giant cities, giant enterprises, and that's the direction that I think the federal system is going. And I think that you're right to rebut the there's some, I guess, like the DC libertarians who will just conflate Trump with an establishment Republican. I think that the proof is in the pudding. The reason why the administrative state has been constantly going after this guy is that he poses a threat to them, and I think it's definitely you're right. You can't ignore that, and you can't just kind of like brush it away. There is legitimate political opposition in this country, but I'm with you. And I think some people in the audience might be shocked to hear that like the election that the government will kind of make sure that the outcome of the election is going to be a certain way. But you saw what they were running in the last election, and with the intrusion of these three-letter agencies. I don't know if you saw that Mark Zuckerberg was just on Joe Rogan's podcast, and he said, hey, the FBI told us that to look out for this story, and the story was here, so we stopped the Hunter Biden laptop story. And that's that's a lot of intrusion into into the election. I don't know what you think about the big tech issue, but certainly as someone who believes in free markets and a free society, I think that's very tricky.
Yeah,
Um,
well, I have very strong feelings about the big tech issue, and I say
yeah.
sue them. I think you should absolutely sue them. And I don't think you need to resort to defamation claims. And I don't think you need to resort to monkeying with Section 230, which was actually had some pretty valid libertarian underpinnings when that was passed in the 90s. It was a very different time. That was the time of like AOL.com. So I don't even care about Section 230. I'm talking about old-fashioned common law contract remedies, waiver, estoppel. I think these terms of service are absolutely nonsense. And I think the way they're enforced is arbitrary, capricious, partisan, you name it. So, I mean, that's a whole other conversation. But this idea that Facebook and Twitter are these private companies, they're publicly held on a stock market. They're not owned by the government. But what's ownership? Ownership is control.
Yeah.
And it sounds like the FBI, at least in part, maybe in small part, controlled what Facebook decided to do. So that's a form of semi-ownership. And as for the political future, I mean, what are economic liberties, to the extent we still have them, are tangible. They're in front of us. If taxes are 40% versus 50%, I mean, you have more actual money in your life. And that can, you can make that tangible. If you're able to work without too many constraints, if you're able to transact without too many constraints, I mean, those reap tangible benefits. I'm not sure what my supposed political liberties get me, at least from my political perspective, or let's say that my adult lifetime. I mean, voting. Well, who have been the candidates in my lifetime? I mean, obviously I love Ron Paul and I'm biased, but apart from that, what is a letter to the editor? Press freedoms. I would give those up tomorrow to in exchange for no more income taxes, for example. So it is pretty illusory, and you just wonder where all this pent up anti-elite energy is going to go, because if they continue down this path of just absolutely marginalizing and polarizing and demonizing I'm not going to say MAGA's 50% of the country. Maybe MAGA's 20 or 30% of the country. Fine. But nonetheless, that's a huge country unto itself. That's 60 million people, folks, 80 million people, whatever it is. And the idea that these people are beyond the pale, the question you have to pose to the left and to Biden after that speech, after that talk last night was, I mean, what should be done with deplorables, right? 30 years ago, the left thought that these people were dying out. Call them white trash, Okies, Appalachians, that they were just going to kind of die out. In the South, there's going to be a new South, a much more multicultural South, for example, the hated South. And that would be that. And then, and that is happening in a sense, but it's happening, I think, slower than they imagined. And that's how Trump won. There's still more deplorables, and they're hanging around longer than they thought. So then for the left, the question becomes, what should be done? Because they won't accept secession. They won't accept that. They won't accept the idea of certain red states breaking away, even though they hate those red states and they claim that they subsidize them. I think that's a little specious, actually, but nonetheless. But they won't let them walk away because of this white savior complex, right? There's black people in those states. There's women who will be denied abortions by these theocratic fascists, etc. So it's interesting. They won't let you walk away, but they also won't tell you what should happen to you. Yeah, and someone ought to pose that question.
It's interesting in the context of an increasingly lawless society, and I think on our end, we have to think about, are there things that we can just start to get away with? It's like, do we need to rebrand the word secession and just call it this is our decentralization or localization movement, and we're just going to create our own system of laws here? And I think that Governor DeSantis has served as a potential rubric for this. I don't think that he's taken any extrajudicial measures, but I can certainly forecast a future in which red state governors decide to give it a little trial run and see, like, technically the federal government has the authority to do this, but our regime is ridiculous and lawless, and we're going to stop playing these games. So I think that in terms of, like, the soft secession or whatever you want to call this movement, I think it's certainly happening. And it's the idea that we're living in a united country with united laws, as you mentioned, is untrue, because there's clear political discrimination happening throughout the country. So I think that that's just probably going to be the inevitable next step, is that you're going to just have, whether it's a DeSantis or probably not Abbott, but someone along those lines is just going to try to test the federal government. And that's when things might get kind of weird, because
that's why he should stay in Florida, right?
Yeah, no,
what's he going to do at the national?
I've written about this, and I 100% think, like, even though I think you're right that they're never going to let Donald Trump win, why do you think that they would let Ron DeSantis win if he's he's just the next Nazi, according to their labels? So send Trump to play with the wolves in DC, see what happens. But I think Florida has something good going for it, and it's best not to screw that up. And I really,
Right.
as a Floridian now, especially, I'm from Jersey and spent a lot of time in DC. But as a Floridian now, it's like I'm not willing to sacrifice my own personal sovereignty so that some sad GOP voter in Seattle can have a little bit better of quality of life. Like, come down to Florida. I don't buy into the argument that we need to lose our best governor in possibly ever to Washington, D.C.
But here's the price. There's always a price. And the price is, let's say, that school district in Florida, when it says, no, we're going to make our own rules. And then they say, well, okay, you're not going to get any federal money. That school district has to be prepared to say, yes, we're not going to get any federal money. And yeah, it's unfair because you're still going to pay federal taxes.
Yeah.
Right? There's always a price. It's not so easy.
Yeah, no. I think that it's just, it's going to be very, very messy future. But with that, again, comes the opportunity of having people with legitimate political authority, like they have a mandate from the people, and they're just, I think, going to see where it takes them. Because certainly, I think if you were to poll, and I know this show goes up on YouTube, so I'll use my language carefully, but if you were to poll many Americans who did not vote for Joe Biden, I think they very much question his legitimacy to rule over them, and genuinely despise this regime right now. So the idea that if one of their local officials on whatever level of government wants to challenge the authority of the federal government, I don't think that's like so incredibly out of bounds. I'm sure that, like, you'll have all these forces on the so-called right who will reject that and say, and clutch their pearls and whatnot. But I think that when the federal government is acting completely lawless, like what else can you do to preserve the rights of your own, of the people who have also elected you into office to defend their rights? So it's a very messy situation, I think, moving forward.
Well, Hillary voters never considered Trump or his administration legitimate.
Yeah.
They treated it as though they were living in an occupied territory, right? I mean,
she did
throughout.
personally.
Absolutely. So I want to read you a tweet from Scott Adams. This is the Dilbert guy.
Mm-hmm.
And I do follow him on Twitter. He runs a little hot and cold for my taste. But anyway, Scott Adams. And this is just today after Biden's talk. And again, we're recording this on Wednesday, folks. It comes out on Friday. But this was a talk that Biden, or a rally, some comments Biden made Tuesday night. So Scott Adams says, Biden's strategy of inciting the dumbest 1% of Republicans to say or do violent stuff so he can pin it on the other 99% is pure evil genius. I mean, is this going to work? Is this polarizing of MAGA? And you notice that maggot is increasingly commonplace. You see a lot of lefties use the term maggots to describe some of their fellow citizens, which isn't a very heartening development. You think this is going to work?
It reminds me of that meme. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but like there's the little kid with the Pepe kid, and then there's a guy with an FBI hat like poking him with a stick and telling him to do something, like do some kind of terrorist act. I don't think that Biden will inspire anyone to do anything. He's just a very uninspirational figure. He will inspire people to buy guns because you can clearly see that the federal government's coming after your Second Amendment
assault
rights.
rifles.
But I don't think
some
that
assault rifles, so-called, will be purchased today. I suspect after that talk.
Yeah, someone on Jesse Kelly's producer Emily put a good tweet together and called it like Schrodinger's gun. That the AR-15 is a deadly assault military style weapon, but completely useless in fighting against the U.S. military when it's carpet bombing you. So it's very interesting dynamic that they're trying to pull. But I don't see that Biden would be inspiring some type of violence. I think he inspires a lot of resentment and a lot of people that want to dismiss him. And it's not even Biden, of course, because he's barely sentient. It's this the federal regime that's just passing notes for him to read. Well,
it's interesting state of affairs. So I want to wrap it up, Jordan. How can people follow you? What's the best way for them to find your Substack and help you with your work?
Yeah, so you can go to dossier.substack.com, and that's where all my writing is. And I very much appreciate everyone's support. And people should certainly support the Mises Institute too. You guys are doing very essential work. You have a bookstore and you have educational classes, and there's so much that you can do to support Mises. And in an era of complete political insanity, and you have all of these regime economists that are representing astrologists basically, which is an insult to astrology. Really, because they're just ridiculous. I think that Mises is very much worth investing in these times.
Well, that's what women say, that economics is astrology for white dudes. So we'll leave it on that, and maybe it is. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank Jordan Schachtel for spending time with us today and sitting in for Bob Murphy, who will be back with us next week. Everybody have a great weekend.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. And in the meantime, you can find more content like this at Mises.org.